The old mule refused to leave the burned barn even after the roof began collapsing around him. Smoke rolled across the farm in thick black waves, sparks drifted over the fields, and every surviving animal had already been driven toward the lower pasture. But Amos planted his hooves beside the center stall and would not move. Farmer Isaiah Carter wrapped a rope around the mule's neck and pulled until his hands bled. Yet the animal only lowered his head and struck the scorched wooden floor with one hoof. Isaiah thought fear had frozen him. Then he heard it, a faint knocking beneath the boards. 3 slow strikes, a pause, then 3 more. Someone was trapped under the barn. Isaiah dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against the floor. The knocking came again, weaker this time, directly beneath Amos's front legs. Isaiah shouted for the firefighters, but the western wall gave a violent crack, and flames climbed the support beams. They had less than a minute before the building collapsed. Amos still refused to move. Isaiah grabbed an iron bar, tore up the first burned plank, and found not soil beneath it, but a hidden metal door with a child's red mitten caught in its hinge. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write in the comments. Would you risk entering a burning barn if an old animal refused to leave the exact place where someone was trapped? Isaiah Carter had owned Carter Ridge Farm in western Kentucky for 26 years. At 55, he was a tall black farmer with broad shoulders, a close gray beard, and the steady manner of someone who had spent most of his life solving problems before sunrise. He raised cattle, grew corn and soybeans, and kept a small herd of mules descended from animals his father once used for logging. Amos was the oldest. The dark bay mule had a white muzzle, a scar across his left shoulder, and one ear that leaned slightly outward after an accident years earlier. At 31, he no longer pulled equipment or carried heavy loads. Isaiah allowed him to wander the farm and sleep wherever he pleased. Neighbors often asked why he continued feeding an animal that no longer worked. Isaiah always gave the same answer. Amos had worked enough. The mule had helped save the farm during drought years, pulled Isaiah's overturned tractor from a ditch, and once stood between a charging bull and Isaiah's daughter. Retirement was not charity. It was a debt being honored. The burned barn stood at the northern edge of the property. Isaiah's grandfather built it almost 90 years earlier, using thick oak beams and stone foundations. The lower section had once stored vegetables during winter, but the entrance was supposedly sealed before Isaiah was born. His father said the cellar flooded and became unsafe. Isaiah never questioned the story. The floor had been replaced several times and no doorway remained visible. On the evening of the fire, Isaiah was repairing a water pump when his 10-year-old neighbor, Caleb Miller, arrived on a red bicycle. Caleb lived on the adjoining property with his mother, Hannah, and his grandfather, Walter Miller. Hannah worked evening shifts at a nursing home, so Caleb often spent time at Carter Ridge after school. He loved animals but trusted Amos most. The old mule tolerated the boy climbing onto his back without a saddle and followed him around the yard like a patient guardian. Caleb came that evening carrying a small backpack and wearing red wool mittens despite the mild weather. "Mom says I have to stay with Grandpa tonight," he told Isaiah, but he's angry again. Walter Miller had changed during the previous year. After a stroke and several financial losses, he became suspicious, irritable, and obsessed with selling the family land. A development company called Vale Agricultural Holdings wanted both the Miller property and the northern acres of Carter Ridge. Its proposed grain processing complex needed direct access to the highway and the river. Isaiah rejected every offer. Hannah also refused because the Miller farmhouse had belonged to her family for generations. Walter, however, insisted selling would solve their debts. 2 weeks earlier, Hannah discovered someone had forged her signature on a preliminary agreement. She suspected Walter had signed for her, but the document was witnessed by Deputy Calvin Ross and prepared by attorney Richard Vale, the development company owner's brother. When she threatened legal action, Walter claimed she was trying to steal his property. Caleb had overheard the arguments. Isaiah told the boy he could remain at Carter Ridge until Hannah finished work. Caleb smiled and went to brush Amos in the barn. Shortly after sunset, Isaiah received a call from Walter. The old man demanded Caleb return immediately. His voice sounded slurred, and another man spoke quietly in the background. Isaiah refused. Walter threatened to call the sheriff, then ended the call. 15 minutes later, Isaiah smelled smoke. Flames had already spread across the barn's eastern wall. The fire moved unnaturally fast, climbing dry wood as though fuel had been poured along the boards. Isaiah ran toward the stalls while calling emergency services. Caleb was nowhere in sight. His bicycle lay beside the barn, one wheel still spinning. Isaiah shouted his name until smoke burned his throat. Amos stood inside the center stall, kicking the door. Isaiah opened it, expecting the mule to flee. Instead, Amos ran toward the rear of the barn and struck the floor. Isaiah searched the hayloft, storage rooms, and tack area, but found no child. He assumed Caleb escaped into the fields. Volunteer firefighters arrived and began moving animals. Hannah reached the farm after receiving Isaiah's frantic call. She said Caleb had never returned home. Walter's truck was gone, and the front door stood open. Deputy Ross arrived soon afterward and immediately claimed Caleb probably started the fire while playing with matches, panicked, and ran away. Isaiah rejected the accusation. Caleb was careful around the barn and had no matches. Ross said children lied when afraid. Then he ordered everyone out because the structure might collapse. Amos refused. The knocking beneath the floor changed the entire emergency. Firefighters cut through the metal door while Isaiah held Amos's rope. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Smoke poured downward, but the chamber below was protected by stone walls. Rescue Captain Lena Brooks entered wearing breathing equipment. Less than a minute later, she called for medical support. Caleb was alive at the bottom of the stairs, wrists tied with plastic cord and a bleeding wound above one eye. Beside him lay another person, Walter Miller. The old man was unconscious, his hands bound behind his back. Firefighters carried them out moments before the barn roof collapsed. Amos finally allowed Isaiah to lead him away. The mule had burns along his back and legs, but he remained standing until Caleb's stretcher passed. Then his knees gave way. Veterinarian Maria Lopez treated him in the pasture, while paramedics rushed Caleb and Walter to the hospital. Caleb regained consciousness first. He remembered brushing Amos when Deputy Ross entered the barn with Richard Vale and a construction foreman named Dean Mercer. Ross said Walter had suffered another stroke, and Caleb needed to come quickly. Caleb followed them toward the center stall. Richard opened a hidden panel in the floor using a metal tool. When Caleb saw Walter tied below, he tried to run. Dean caught him and struck his head. They carried him into the cellar. Walter had agreed to help Vale Agricultural Holdings force Hannah to sell, but he changed his mind after discovering the company intended to store hazardous chemicals beside the river rather than operate only a grain facility. He secretly collected documents proving Richard Vale bribed officials, forged ownership records, and purchased farms through threats and stage accidents. Walter planned to give the evidence to Isaiah because he no longer trusted local law enforcement. Ross and Richard learned of the plan. They abducted Walter from his house, searched for the documents, and brought him to Carter Ridge because an old survey showed a cellar beneath the barn connecting to a drainage tunnel. They intended to leave both Walter and Caleb underground, burn the structure, and blame the fire on the child. The sealed cellar would either collapse or fill with smoke, destroying evidence and witnesses. But they did not know Amos had spent years sleeping above the hidden entrance. The mule heard movement beneath the floor. Caleb said that while the men argued upstairs, Amos began stamping. Caleb kicked the underside of the metal door in the same rhythm. Amos answered. "I knew he could hear me," Caleb told Isaiah from his hospital bed. "He always knew when I came into the barn, even when he couldn't see me." Investigators searched the ruins. The fire had destroyed most of the upper barn, but the stone cellar survived. Inside, they found fuel containers, discarded restraints, Walter's blood, and a broken briefcase. The documents were missing. Deputy Ross claimed he entered the barn only after firefighters arrived and denied knowing about the cellar. Several volunteers remembered seeing his patrol vehicle near the Miller property before the fire, but no one had photographed it. Richard Vale said he had been at a charity dinner 60 miles away. Security footage appeared to confirm his presence until investigators noticed the timestamp jumped forward by 43 minutes. Dean Mercer disappeared. Sheriff Elena Grant took control of the case and removed Ross from duty. State police searched his home and found cash payments from Vale Agricultural Holdings, copies of land complaints he had closed without investigation, and photographs of farms targeted for acquisition. Carter Ridge appeared on a map with the northern barn circled. Beside it were the words "Old Access" below. Isaiah finally learned the truth about the cellar. During Prohibition, His grandfather used the underground chamber to store grain and later helped black families hide there while escaping racial violence in neighboring counties. The drainage tunnel connected the barn to a wooded ravine beyond the farm boundary. Isaiah's father sealed the entrance after part of the tunnel collapsed, but Richard Vail found original plans in county archives. The developers wanted the tunnel because it crossed beneath both Carter and Miller land and opened near the river. It could be expanded into a concealed waste disposal route. Vail Agricultural Holdings had already buried industrial chemicals on properties acquired through foreclosure. Walter discovered contaminated water near an abandoned farm and traced hauling records back to Dean Mercer. The company planned to obtain the remaining land before environmental inspectors arrived. If Isaiah and Hannah refused to sell, Richard intended to create insurance claims, code violations, and financial pressure until they lost ownership. The fire was not the first attack. A tractor brake failure 3 months earlier had nearly killed Isaiah. Amos had blocked the equipment shed that morning and refused to let Isaiah drive until he noticed fluid leaking beneath the machine. At the time, Isaiah blamed age and corrosion. Investigators later found the brake line had been cut. The mule had not understood sabotage, but he smelled the fluid and reacted to something unusual. Walter remained unconscious for 3 days. When he woke, he admitted forging Hannah's signature after Richard promised enough money to pay medical debts and leave Caleb an inheritance. He believed the development would create jobs. Then he found company records showing fake environmental tests, unexplained illnesses near other Vail sites, and payments to Ross. Walter copied everything onto a flash drive. Before Ross abducted him, he hid it somewhere Caleb would recognize. Caleb remembered his grandfather giving him a small wooden horse and saying, "Keep this beside your friend." The toy remained inside Caleb's backpack, which firefighters found near Amos's stall after the fire. Its base contained a hidden compartment. Inside was the flash drive. The files transformed the case. They documented forged deeds, bribed inspectors, illegal chemical dumping, arson payments, and conversations about intimidating property owners. One recording captured Richard Vail saying, "Once Carter's barn burns, the old tunnel becomes unusable evidence. The boy gives us the explanation." Another voice, identified as Deputy Ross, asked what would happen if Caleb survived. Richard replied, "Then make sure he remembers nothing clearly." Arrest warrants were issued for Richard, Ross, and Dean. Ross attempted to flee but was stopped at a state border. Richard vanished from the charity event before police arrived. Dean's abandoned truck was found near the river, with blood on the steering wheel and a burned map inside. Investigators initially feared the men had killed him. Then Amos began behaving strangely again. While recovering in a temporary enclosure, he repeatedly walked toward the western field and brayed at night. His injuries made long movement painful, yet he pushed against the gate whenever vehicles approached from the road. Isaiah assumed the mule was traumatized by the fire. One morning, Amos escaped by breaking a loose latch. He crossed the field toward the wooded ravine where the cellar tunnel ended. Isaiah followed with Sheriff Elena and 2 officers. The tunnel exit had been disguised beneath fallen branches. Fresh footprints surrounded it. Inside, they found food cans, ammunition, medical supplies, and Richard Vail's jacket. The fugitives were using the old passage after the fire. A trail of blood led deeper underground. Dean Mercer was found alive in a side chamber, handcuffed to a pipe. He had tried taking the flash drive from Walter before the abduction, but failed. After the fire, Richard and Ross blamed him for leaving evidence. They beat him and abandoned him inside the tunnel when police closed the roads. Dean agreed to cooperate in exchange for protection. He revealed that Richard planned to destroy chemical barrels stored beneath a closed feed mill. Burning them would release toxic smoke across nearby towns, but Richard believed the disaster could be blamed on old equipment and erase the company's largest illegal site. Ross was supposed to help him escape by boat afterward. Ross's arrest forced Richard to act alone. The feed mill stood beside the river, 6 miles downstream. State police and hazardous material teams surrounded it. Richard had already started a fire inside the warehouse and locked 2 night workers in an office. Officers rescued them while firefighters contained the flames. Richard fled through an underground culvert carrying a rifle. Isaiah was not involved in the search, but Amos's discovery of the tunnel allowed authorities to predict where the culvert emerged. Richard was captured near the river before reaching a hidden boat. The chemical barrels were removed under federal supervision. Testing showed several had leaked into groundwater. Families near previous Vale properties underwent medical screening, and cleanup continued for years. Richard Vale, Calvin Ross, and Dean Mercer faced charges involving kidnapping, attempted murder, arson, conspiracy, corruption, fraud, environmental crimes, and obstruction. Dean's cooperation reduced his sentence, but recordings proved he personally assaulted Walter and Caleb. Ross argued he only followed Richard's instructions because of gambling debts and fear. The court found he repeatedly used his badge to silence victims and protect crimes. Richard portrayed the barn fire as a desperate act committed by employees without his knowledge. The flash drive recordings, financial records, and his attempt to destroy the feed mill proved otherwise. All three received lengthy prison sentences. Vale Agricultural Holdings was dissolved. Seized assets funded environmental restoration and compensation for farmers whose land had been taken through fraud. Hannah regained full control of the Miller property. Walter transferred his remaining ownership to her and entered assisted living after admitting his choices endangered his family. Hannah did not forgive him immediately. She allowed Caleb to visit but insisted Walter accept responsibility without blaming illness, debt, or manipulation. "They used your fear," she told him, "but you opened the door." Walter agreed. He spent his remaining years helping investigators identify other forged agreements. Carter Ridge Farm survived, though the barn could not be saved. Isaiah considered building a modern steel structure on another part of the property. Caleb asked him to rebuild on the original stone foundation. "That's where Amos hurt us," he said. Isaiah agreed, but the new barn included fire-resistant materials, sprinklers, exterior cameras, and a clearly marked entrance to the restored cellar. Historians examined the underground chamber and documented its earlier use as a place of refuge. Isaiah opened part of it as a small local museum honoring families his grandfather helped protect. The hidden space that criminals tried using as a grave became a place where race stories were preserved. Amos recovered more slowly. The burns healed into pale scars and smoke damaged his lungs. He could no longer walk far, but he returned to the new barn when construction ended. Caleb visited every afternoon, sitting beside him and reading aloud. The mule always lifted his head at the boy's footsteps. Specialists explained that mules possess strong memory, sensitive hearing, and deep familiarity with routines. Amos likely heard voices or movement beneath the floor, and associated Caleb's knocking with the child he knew. He may also have smelled smoke rising differently around the metal door. His refusal to leave was not proof that he understood kidnapping or rescue. It was proof that he recognized something wrong and trusted his own senses more than the humans pulling him away. Caleb understood this better than reporters who called Amos a miracle animal. "He didn't know the whole story," the boy said during one interview. "He just knew I was still there." Years passed. Caleb grew taller, stopped wearing red mittens, and became skilled at caring for animals. He studied veterinary medicine, specializing in working animals injured during disasters. He said Amos taught him that fear and stubbornness were sometimes forms of communication. Isaiah continued farming, but reduced the size of his cattle herd. The restored barn became the safest building on the property. A bronze plate near the center stall showed the outline of a mule's hoof above 3 engraved knocks. Beneath it were the words, "Pay attention when loyalty refuses to move." Amos lived until 36. During his final winter, arthritis made standing difficult. Isaiah and Caleb prepared a warm stall beside the place where the hidden door had been. On his last morning, Amos rested with his head in Caleb's lap while sunlight entered through the new barn windows. Caleb tapped the floor 3 times. After a long pause, Amos moved one hoof and answered with a single weak strike. He died peacefully that afternoon. They buried him on the hill overlooking the barn. The old red mitten recovered from the cellar hinge had remained in police evidence until the final appeal ended. Caleb placed it inside a weatherproof box beneath Amos's memorial stone. He kept the other mitten at home. Visitors often heard a shortened version of what happened. An old mule refused to leave a burning barn until a farmer discovered a child trapped under the floor. The full truth contained forged land agreements, police corruption, illegal waste, and a family nearly destroyed by fear and greed. But the beginning remained simple. Men created a fire because they believed flames would make every sound disappear. Amos stood over the hidden door and listened. Firefighters saw an unmanageable animal. Isaiah saw an old friend behaving unlike himself. Caleb, trapped in darkness, struck the metal above his head and waited. The mule answered by refusing to leave.